My name is Emma, and I need to tell you about the most terrifying experience of my life. What I thought was friendship turned out to be a calculated plan to literally steal my identity and take over my entire existence. This happened in Portland, Oregon, and by the time I figured out what was going on, my best friend Rachel had already convinced half the people in my life that I was having a mental breakdown and she was just trying to help me. I met Rachel Martinez 3 years ago at a coffee shop near my apartment in the Pearl District. I was working on my laptop, struggling with a particularly difficult freelance marketing project, when this woman approached my table and complimented my work. She said she was also in marketing and wondered if we might collaborate on some projects. That conversation led to a friendship that I thought was one of the best things that had ever happened to me. Rachel was everything I wished I could be. She was confident, outgoing, stylish, and seemed to have her life completely together. She worked for a prestigious marketing firm downtown, lived in a beautiful apartment, and always knew the right thing to say in any situation. When she suggested we become roommates to split costs, I jumped at the chance. I thought living with someone so put together might help me get my own life on track. The first year we lived together was amazing. Rachel helped me organize my home office, introduced me to new clients, and even helped me update my wardrobe. She was supportive when I was stressed about work, encouraging when I doubted myself, and always available when I needed to talk. I felt like I had finally found the sister I never had. But looking back now, I can see that Rachel was studying me during that first year. She was learning my habits, my mannerisms, my way of speaking, even my handwriting. She memorized the stories I told about my childhood, my family, and my dreams for the future. She asked detailed questions about everything, and I was flattered by her interest. I thought she cared about me. I didn't realize she was collecting information. The changes started small during our second year living together. Rachel began dressing more like me, copying my style choices, and even buying the same brands I preferred. She started using phrases that I used frequently, adopting my mannerisms, and even changing her hair to match mine more closely. When I mentioned these similarities, she laughed them off, saying that roommates always start to resemble each other. She also began inserting herself more deeply into my professional life. She would answer my business phone when I was out, claiming she was just helping me stay organized. She started attending networking events with me, introducing herself as my business partner, even though we had never discussed any formal partnership. When clients called, she would sometimes handle the initial conversation before passing them to me. "Emma's so lucky to have you looking out for her," clients would say. "You're such a good friend." I thought Rachel was just being helpful. I was grateful to have someone who cared enough to support my career. I didn't realize she was positioning herself to gradually take over my professional relationships. The real warning signs started 6 months ago. I began noticing small discrepancies in my business accounts. Payments that should have been direct deposited were sometimes checks made out to R. Martinez instead of Emma Sullivan. When I asked Rachel about it, she explained that some clients had gotten confused about our business partnership, and she had just deposited the checks into my account after endorsing them. "You should really set up a joint business account," she suggested. "It would make these mix-ups easier to handle." I almost agreed. Rachel had been so helpful with everything else, and managing finances had never been my strong suit. But something held me back. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe I was just paranoid, but I decided to keep my business accounts separate. Around the same time, I started getting strange comments from people in my life. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, mentioned that she had seen me walking my dog at unusual times, even though I had been out of town for work. My mother called to ask why I had seemed so different during our last phone conversation, saying I had used words and expressions that didn't sound like me. "Are you feeling all right, sweetheart?" she asked. "You just seemed like a different person." When I told Rachel about these comments, she suggested that I might be stressed and not remembering things clearly. She offered to help me keep better track of my schedule and even suggested I see a therapist to help manage what she called my anxiety issues. The most disturbing incident happened 3 weeks ago. I came home from a client meeting to find Rachel sitting at my computer working on a project that I recognized as one of my current assignments. She was logged into my email account and had been responding to messages from my clients. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh, hi, Emma," she said brightly. "I hope you don't mind, but Jennifer from TechStart called with an urgent question about the campaign timeline. You weren't answering your phone, so I just logged in to check the project details and help her out." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had never given Rachel my email password. "How did you get into my account?" "You wrote it down on that sticky note on your monitor," she said, pointing to a note I had never written. "Don't you remember?" I stared at the sticky note. It was written in handwriting that looked like mine, but I had no memory of writing it. The password was correct, but it wasn't something I would have written down where anyone could see it. Rachel, I never wrote that note. Her expression changed slightly, and for just a moment, I saw something cold in her eyes. But then she smiled again. Emma, you've been so stressed lately. You probably wrote it down and forgot. Maybe you should take a break. I can handle your client work for a few days while you rest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the password note, the strange comments from people, and the way Rachel had been so eager to take over various aspects of my life. I decided to do some investigating. I started by checking my credit report online. What I found made me sick. There were several new credit card accounts opened in my name over the past 6 months, all with addresses I didn't recognize. Someone had been using my social security number and personal information to establish credit in my name. Next, I checked my business bank account more carefully. I discovered that several large payments from clients had been redirected to an account I didn't recognize. The account was in my name, but at a bank I had never used, with an address that turned out to be a mailbox rental facility across town. My hands were shaking as I called my bank's fraud department. Miss Sullivan, we show that you opened this account yourself 6 months ago, the representative explained. You provided proper identification and even brought a witness to verify your identity. What was the name of the witness? I asked. A Rachel Martinez. She signed the paperwork confirming your identity. I felt like I was going to be sick. Rachel had helped someone impersonate me to open fraudulent bank accounts. But who had impersonated me? And how had they fooled the bank? The next morning, while Rachel was at work, I searched her room. I felt terrible about violating her privacy, but I needed to understand what was happening. What I found in her closet changed everything. Hidden behind her winter clothes was a large box filled with documents, photographs, and personal items. There were copies of my birth certificate, social security card, and passport. There were dozens of photographs of me that I had never seen before, apparently taken without my knowledge over the past 2 years. There were pages of notes in Rachel's handwriting, documenting my daily routines, my speech patterns, even my facial expressions. But the most shocking discovery was a series of photographs showing Rachel dressed exactly like me, with her hair styled to match mine and makeup applied to make her look as much like me as possible. In some of the photos, she was practicing my signature. In others, she was posing with fake identification documents that had her photo but my name and information. At the bottom of the box was a folder labeled Phase 3. Inside were detailed plans for what Rachel called identity completion. The documents outlined her plan to gradually convince everyone in my life that I was having a mental breakdown, while she stepped in to help by taking over my responsibilities. The final step was to have me committed to a psychiatric facility while she legally changed her name to mine and took over my life completely. I photographed everything with my phone and then carefully put everything back exactly as I had found it. I needed to figure out my next move without alerting Rachel to what I had discovered. That afternoon, I called my brother Michael, who lived in Seattle. I needed to talk to someone I trusted completely. Mike, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Em. What's going on? Have I seemed different to you lately? When we talk on the phone, do I sound like myself? There was a pause. Actually, now that you mention it, yeah. Sometimes when you call, you sound a little different. Your voice is the same, but you use different words, different phrases. I figured you were just changing as you got older. When was the last time this happened? Last Tuesday. You called to ask about Mom's birthday party, but you kept calling her Mother instead of Mom, and you asked about relatives you've never cared about before. It was weird, but I just assumed you were trying to be more formal or something. My heart started racing. Last Tuesday, I had been in meetings all day. I hadn't called Michael at all, but apparently someone who sounded like me had called him, pretending to be me. Mike, I never called you last Tuesday. What do you mean? Of course you did. We talked for 20 minutes. I explained everything I had discovered about Rachel, the fraudulent accounts, and the box of documents. Michael listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Emma, this is insane. You're saying Rachel has been impersonating you? I think she's been practicing for months, maybe years. She's learned to imitate my voice, my mannerisms, everything. And she's been using that ability to gradually insert herself into my life while making me look unstable. We need to call the police immediately. I will, but first I need to gather more evidence. If Rachel realizes I know what she's doing, she might accelerate whatever she has planned. That evening, I pretended everything was normal when Rachel came home from work. She seemed relaxed and cheerful, asking about my day and suggesting we order takeout for dinner. Watching her act so casually, knowing what I had discovered in her room, was terrifying. How was your day? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Great. I had lunch with Jennifer from TechStart. She mentioned that you've seemed a little scattered lately on your project calls. I told her you've been under a lot of stress and offered to help coordinate things until you're feeling better. Jennifer from TechStart was one of my most important clients. The fact that Rachel was having lunch meetings with her, discussing my supposed mental state, was exactly the kind of manipulation I had read about in her plans. I haven't been scattered on client calls, I said carefully. Rachel gave me a concerned look. Emma, honey, maybe you don't realize how you've been coming across. Sometimes when we're stressed, we don't see things clearly. That's why it's so important to have friends who can help us stay grounded. The gaslighting was so smooth, so convincing, that for a moment I almost doubted my own memories. But then I remembered the box in her closet and the fraudulent bank accounts. Rachel, have you ever answered my business phone when I wasn't here? Only when you've asked me to, she said. You know how much I care about your success. I would never do anything to interfere with your business unless you specifically requested help. Another lie delivered with perfect sincerity. I realized that Rachel was probably a sociopath, someone with no empathy who could lie without any emotional response. She had been playing a character for 3 years, and she was very good at it. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day gathering evidence. I went to the bank where the fraudulent account had been opened and asked to see the security footage from the day the account was created. The bank manager was initially reluctant, but when I explained that someone had stolen my identity, he agreed to review the footage with me. What I saw on the security camera confirmed my worst fears. The woman who had opened the account in my name was Rachel, but she had somehow altered her appearance to look even more like me than usual. She was wearing clothes identical to ones I owned, had styled her hair exactly like mine, and had even practiced my posture and gestures. When she signed the paperwork, her signature was a perfect forgery of mine. She's very good, the bank manager said quietly. If I hadn't known to look for discrepancies, I would have sworn it was the same person. How is that possible? Don't you check ID? She had a driver's license with your name in her photo. It looked completely legitimate. Rachel had somehow obtained fake identification documents that were sophisticated enough to fool a bank. This wasn't amateur fraud. This was a professional-level identity theft operation. My next stop was the police station. I brought copies of all the evidence I had gathered, the fraudulent bank accounts, the credit cards opened in my name, photos of Rachel's impersonation materials, and the security footage from the bank. Detective Sarah Martinez, no relation to Rachel, I confirmed, listened to my story with increasing concern. Miss Sullivan, what you're describing is one of the most sophisticated identity theft cases I've ever seen. This goes beyond financial fraud. This person is trying to literally become you. What can you do to stop her? We can arrest her for fraud and identity theft, but I'm concerned about your safety. If she's as unstable as you're describing, confronting her could be dangerous. Do you have somewhere else you can stay while we investigate? I nodded. I can stay with my brother in Seattle. Good. I recommend you pack a bag secretly and leave as soon as possible. We'll obtain a warrant to search your apartment and arrest Ms. Martinez, but it may take a day or two to coordinate everything. That evening, I packed a small bag while Rachel was in the shower. I told her I was going to visit my brother for a few days to clear my head and get some perspective on my stress levels. She was very supportive of the idea. That's exactly what you need, she said, giving me a hug. Take all the time you need. I'll take care of everything here. I was sure she would. In fact, I was certain that my absence would give her the opportunity to accelerate whatever final phase of her plan she had been preparing. I drove to Seattle that night, calling Detective Martinez from the road to confirm that I was safely away from the apartment. She promised to call me as soon as they had Rachel in custody. The call came 2 days later. Detective Martinez's voice was grim. We arrested Rachel Martinez this morning on charges of identity theft, fraud, and forgery. But Miss Sullivan, what we found in her room was much worse than what you had described. What do you mean? She had been documenting your life in incredible detail for over 3 years. We found thousands of photographs, detailed notes about your habits and preferences, recordings of your voice, even samples of your handwriting that she had been practicing to forge. Detective Martinez paused. But the most disturbing thing was her timeline. She had been planning to have you declared mentally incompetent so she could become your legal guardian. Once she had legal control over your life, she planned to have you committed to a psychiatric facility while she took over your identity completely. I felt sick. How close was she to making that happen? Very close. She had already contacted several people in your life, clients, family members, neighbors, to express concern about your mental state. She had documentation of supposed incidents where you had been confused or disoriented, most of which we believe she fabricated. She was building a case to have you evaluated for competency. The plan was more diabolical than I had imagined. Rachel hadn't just been stealing my money, she had been systematically undermining my credibility and mental health so she could legally take control of my entire life. Detective Martinez, how did she learn to impersonate me so convincingly? From what we can tell, she's done this before. We found evidence that Rachel Martinez isn't even her real name. We believe her actual name is Rebecca Walsh, and she's wanted in connection with similar identity theft cases in 3 other states. I was speechless. The woman I had considered my best friend for 3 years was apparently a professional identity thief who had targeted multiple victims. The good news is that we've frozen all the fraudulent accounts, and we'll be able to recover most of your stolen money. The bad news is that untangling all the damage she's done to your reputation and relationships is going to take time. Over the next few weeks, I had to make dozens of phone calls to explain the situation to clients, family members, and friends. Many of them had received calls from me, actually Rachel, that had been designed to make me seem unstable or unreliable. My client Jennifer from TechStart was shocked when I explained what had happened. "Emma, I'm so sorry. When Rachel called to discuss your project, she sounded exactly like you. She told me you had been having memory problems and anxiety issues, and she was helping to manage your workload. I thought she was being a good friend." Similar conversations happened with my mother, my neighbors, and several other clients. Rachel had been systematically contacting everyone in my life, impersonating me to plant seeds of doubt about my mental health, while positioning herself as my helpful, concerned friend. The most disturbing revelation came when Detective Martinez called with an update on Rachel's background. "Emma, we've been in contact with police in Oregon, California, and Nevada. Rebecca Walsh, Rachel's real name, has been running this same con for at least 8 years. She targets successful, isolated women, befriends them, studies them, and then gradually takes over their lives." How many other victims were there? At least 4 that we know of. One woman in Portland was actually committed to a psychiatric facility for 6 months while Rebecca lived her life. By the time the truth came out, Rebecca had disappeared with over $300,000, and the woman's entire social and professional network had been convinced she was mentally ill. I thought about how close I had come to that same fate. If I hadn't discovered Rachel's plans when I did, I might have ended up in a psychiatric facility while she lived in my apartment, worked with my clients, and gradually convinced everyone that Emma Sullivan was too unstable to manage her own life. The legal proceedings took almost a year. Rachel, Rebecca, was eventually sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. But the sentence felt inadequate, considering the psychological damage she had done to multiple victims. During the trial, I learned more details about her methods. She was incredibly skilled at psychological manipulation, able to mirror people's personalities and gain their trust quickly. She specifically targeted women who were somewhat isolated, either because they worked from home, had recently moved to new cities, or had small social circles. "She's what we call a social predator," explained Dr. Patricia Wong, a forensic psychologist who testified about Rachel's behavior patterns. "She has no empathy or genuine emotional connections, but she's extremely skilled at mimicking normal human emotions and relationships. To her victims, she seems like the perfect friend." The hardest part of recovery wasn't the financial damage. I was able to recover most of my stolen money. The hardest part was learning to trust people again. Rachel had been so convincing, so supportive, so seemingly genuine, that I began to doubt my ability to judge character. I moved back to Portland 6 months after Rachel's arrest, but I found a new apartment in a different neighborhood. I couldn't bear to live in the place where she had studied me for 3 years, planning to steal my entire life. Rebuilding my business relationships was challenging. Even though my clients understood intellectually that I had been the victim of an elaborate fraud, some of them remained uncomfortable working with me. The situation had been so bizarre, so unprecedented, that people didn't know how to react. I ended up starting fresh with many aspects of my life. New clients, new social circles, new routines. In some ways, it was liberating. I realized that I had been living a fairly isolated life before Rachel, which had made me an ideal target for her manipulation. I joined a support group for identity theft victims, which helped me understand that what had happened to me wasn't my fault. The other members of the group had experienced different types of fraud, but we all shared the same feelings of violation and self-doubt. "The hardest part isn't the money," said one woman whose sister had stolen her identity. "It's feeling like you can't trust your own judgment about people." Therapy also helped. My therapist, Dr. Amanda Chen, specialized in trauma recovery and helped me understand how sophisticated manipulators operate. "Emma, what you experienced was essentially psychological warfare," she explained. Rachel was trained, either formally or through experience, in techniques designed to break down your sense of reality and make you dependent on her validation. The fact that you eventually recognized what was happening shows incredible strength and intuition. Slowly, I began to rebuild my confidence in my ability to judge people and situations. I learned to trust my instincts again and to recognize the difference between genuine friendship and manipulation. 2 years later, I'm in a much better place. My business is thriving. I have genuine friendships with people who knew nothing about the Rachel situation, and I'm even in a healthy romantic relationship with someone who understands my need to take things slowly. Most importantly, I've learned to value my privacy and independence in new ways. I no longer share personal information casually. I maintain better boundaries in relationships, and I trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I still get updates from Detective Martinez occasionally. Rachel, Rebecca, is serving her sentence in federal prison, and the investigation into her activities helped law enforcement develop better protocols for identifying and stopping this type of sophisticated identity theft. Your case was a turning point, Detective Martinez told me recently. The evidence you gathered and your willingness to testify helped us understand how these predators operate. We've been able to prevent similar cases because of what we learned from your experience. That knowledge helps, but it doesn't completely erase the trauma of discovering that someone I trusted completely had been planning to steal my entire existence. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it changed my understanding of what people are capable of. But I've also learned that surviving something like this reveals strengths you didn't know you had. I'm more confident now, more self-reliant, and much better at recognizing genuine versus manipulative behavior in others. If you're reading this because you suspect someone in your life might be manipulating you, please trust your instincts. Genuine friends don't need to insert themselves into every aspect of your life. They don't try to manage your relationships with other people. They don't make you doubt your own memory or perception of events. Real friendship is about mutual respect and support, not about one person gradually taking control of another person's life. If someone seems too interested in your personal information, too eager to help with important tasks, or too quick to explain away concerning behavior, pay attention to those red flags. The woman I thought was my best friend turned out to be my worst nightmare, but surviving her manipulation taught me what real friendship actually looks like. And that knowledge has led to relationships that are healthier and more genuine than anything I experienced during those 3 years with Rachel. Sometimes the worst betrayal teaches you the most important lessons about protecting yourself and building a life that truly belongs to you. The aftermath of Rachel's arrest revealed even more disturbing details about her operation. Detective Martinez contacted me 3 months after the trial to share new information that had emerged from ongoing investigations. Emma, we've discovered that Rachel, Rebecca, was part of a larger network of identity thieves. She wasn't working alone. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean, a network? We found communications on her encrypted devices that show she was reporting to someone higher up in the organization. She was essentially a field operative, gathering intelligence and executing identity theft operations under supervision. Detective Martinez explained that law enforcement agencies across multiple states had been tracking this network for years. Rachel's arrest had provided the breakthrough they needed to understand how the organization operated. The network specifically targets professional women between the ages of 25 and 40 who work from home or have flexible schedules. They look for people who are somewhat isolated, financially successful, and trusting by nature. I felt sick thinking about how perfectly I had fit their victim profile. How many other people are they targeting right now? We're working on that. Based on Rachel's communications, we believe there are at least a dozen other active operations in progress across the western United States. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. They had been running sophisticated long-term cons for years, systematically destroying lives while stealing millions of dollars. The good news is that your testimony and the evidence you gathered has given us the tools we need to take down the entire network. We've already made arrests in California, Nevada, and Washington State. Over the following months, I was contacted several times by law enforcement agencies investigating related cases. My experience with Rachel had become a template for understanding how these criminals operated, and my detailed documentation of her methods was being used to train police officers and FBI agents. But the most meaningful contact came from other victims. Through the Victim Services Coordinator, I was put in touch with 3 other women who had survived similar identity theft schemes in different states. Jennifer Walsh from Sacramento had been targeted by someone calling herself Kelly Anderson, who had posed as a potential business partner for almost 2 years before attempting to steal her entire marketing consultancy business. It's almost identical to what happened to you, Jennifer told me during our first phone call. She studied me, copied my mannerisms, gradually took over aspects of my business, and then tried to have me declared mentally incompetent when I started asking questions. Susan Martinez from Las Vegas had been victimized by Amanda Cross, who had posed as a concerned neighbor for 3 years while systematically draining her real estate investment accounts. The psychological manipulation was the worst part, Susan explained. By the time I realized what was happening, I didn't trust my own memories anymore. She had convinced half my family that I was having mental health problems. The third victim, Patricia Chen from Denver, had actually been committed to a psychiatric facility for 4 months while her identity thief lived her life and liquidated her assets. I lost everything, Patricia said. My business, my savings, my house, even my relationship with my family. The woman who stole my identity was so convincing that my own sister believed I was having a psychotic break. Talking to these other victims was both heartbreaking and healing. We understood each other in a way that no one else could. We had all experienced the same type of calculated, professional manipulation, and we had all struggled with the same feelings of self-doubt and betrayal. We decided to form a support group that met monthly via video call. Over time, our group grew to include other victims of sophisticated fraud schemes, people who had been targeted by romance scammers, business partnership frauds, and various other types of long-term manipulation. What we experienced isn't random crime, Jennifer observed during one of our meetings. These are military precision psychological operations designed to break down our sense of reality and make us question our own perceptions. Our support group eventually caught the attention of Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a researcher at Stanford University who specialized in studying sophisticated fraud operations. She asked if we would be willing to participate in a research study designed to help law enforcement and mental health professionals better understand the psychological impact of long-term manipulation schemes. Your experiences represent a new category of crime that we're just beginning to understand, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Traditional identity theft is typically financial and brief. What you've experienced is identity replacement, an attempt to literally steal your entire life and existence. Participating in the research study was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Dr. Rodriguez helped us understand that our experiences were part of a broader pattern of sophisticated criminal behavior that was becoming more common as technology made it easier to impersonate people and manipulate information. You weren't targeted because you were gullible or naive, she explained. You were targeted because you possessed specific psychological and financial characteristics that made you ideal victims for this type of operation. The research revealed that victims of identity replacement schemes showed patterns of trauma similar to those experienced by survivors of long-term domestic abuse or cult manipulation. The systematic erosion of trust in our own perceptions, combined with the betrayal by someone we had considered a close friend, created a specific type of psychological injury that required specialized treatment approaches. Dr. Rodriguez's research was eventually published in several academic journals and became required reading for FBI training programs focused on identity theft investigations. Our support group was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences and victim services training seminars. Your willingness to share your experiences is literally saving other people from going through what you went through, Dr. Rodriguez told us. The protocols that law enforcement agencies are now using to identify and investigate these schemes are based directly on what we learned from studying your cases. 3 years after Rachel's arrest, I received an unexpected phone call from Detective Martinez. Emma, I have some news that I think you'll want to hear. We've arrested the leader of Rachel's network. The man's name was Robert Kellerman, and he had been running sophisticated fraud operations for over 15 years. He recruited and trained people like Rachel, provided them with fake documents and technical support, and took a percentage of their profits. Kellerman had been running what was essentially a school for identity thieves, Detective Martinez explained. He would recruit people with acting or sales backgrounds, train them in psychological manipulation techniques, and then send them out to target specific types of victims. The investigation revealed that Kellerman's organization had defrauded victims out of more than $50 million over the past decade. They had operated in dozens of cities, always staying ahead of law enforcement by constantly changing their methods and moving to new locations. Rachel was actually one of his most successful operatives. Her ability to maintain long-term cover identities and manipulate victims was considered exceptional by the organization's standards. I felt a strange mix of vindication and disgust. It was validating to know that I had been targeted by professionals, that my inability to detect Rachel's deception earlier wasn't a personal failing. But it was also disturbing to know that there were people in the world who made their living by psychologically torturing innocent victims. What's going to happen to him? He's facing federal charges that could result in a life sentence. The FBI has been trying to catch him for years, and your case provided the breakthrough they needed. 6 months later, I was asked to testify at Kellerman's trial. It was intimidating to face the man who had orchestrated the destruction of so many lives, but I felt obligated to help ensure he received appropriate punishment. Kellerman was a nondescript man in his 50s who could have been anyone's neighbor or coworker. There was nothing obviously sinister about his appearance, which made his crimes even more chilling. He had built an empire of psychological manipulation while looking like the most ordinary person imaginable. During my testimony, I described in detail how Rachel had systematically invaded and corrupted every aspect of my life. I explained how the manipulation had affected not just my finances, but my relationships, my mental health, and my basic sense of reality. Mr. Kellerman's organization didn't just steal money, I told the jury. They stole our identities, our peace of mind, and our ability to trust other people. The psychological damage they caused will last far longer than any financial losses. The prosecutor presented evidence showing that Kellerman had personally overseen Rachel's operation against me, providing guidance on how to accelerate the timeline and maximize the financial take. He had reviewed photos of me, studied reports about my daily routines, and even suggested specific psychological pressure points that Rachel should exploit. The defendant treated these victims like experiments, the prosecutor argued. He was constantly refining his techniques, learning new ways to manipulate and control people, and then teaching those methods to his operatives. Kellerman was ultimately sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. At 52 years old, it was effectively a life sentence, but even that punishment felt inadequate considering the scope of the damage he had caused. After the trial, I was approached by a literary agent who suggested I write a book about my experience. Initially, I was reluctant. I had spent 3 years trying to move past the trauma, and the idea of reliving it in detail was exhausting. But the agent convinced me that my story could serve as both a warning to potential victims and a guide for survivors of similar crimes. There are thousands of people out there who are being targeted by these schemes right now, she explained. Your book could help them recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Writing the book was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. It required me to examine every detail of my relationship with Rachel, to identify all the red flags I had missed, and to confront the ways in which I had unknowingly enabled her manipulation. But it was also therapeutic. The process of organizing my thoughts and experiences into a coherent narrative helped me understand patterns that I hadn't recognized while living through the events. The most insidious aspect of identity replacement schemes is how gradually they unfold, I wrote in one chapter. The manipulation happens so slowly, with each boundary violation being only slightly worse than the last, that victims don't realize they're being systematically compromised until it's almost too late. The book, titled Stolen Life: How My Best Friend Tried to Become Me, was published 18 months after Kellerman's trial. It became a bestseller, apparently striking a chord with readers who had experienced various forms of manipulation and betrayal. But more importantly, it generated hundreds of emails from people who recognized similar patterns in their own relationships. Several readers contacted law enforcement after reading the book, leading to the discovery and prevention of ongoing identity theft schemes. Your book saved my life, wrote one woman from Phoenix. My roommate had been doing exactly what Rachel did to you. I recognized the patterns and got out before she could complete whatever she had planned. Another email came from a man whose business partner had been gradually taking control of their company using techniques similar to Rachel's. I thought I was going crazy because things kept happening that I didn't remember agreeing to. After reading your book, I realized I was being manipulated and was able to protect my business before it was too late. The response to the book led to speaking engagements at universities, law enforcement conferences, and victim advocacy organizations. I found myself becoming an expert on something I never wanted to know anything about, but I realized that my experience could serve a purpose beyond my own healing. During one particularly memorable speaking engagement at Portland State University, a young woman in the audience raised her hand during the Q&A session. "How do you trust people again after something like that?" she asked. "I mean, if someone can fool you for 3 years, how do you know you won't be fooled again?" It was a question I had been asking myself for years, and I was finally ready to answer it honestly. "You don't," I said. "You never have complete certainty about anyone. But you learn to trust your instincts better, to pay attention to red flags, and to maintain better boundaries. Most importantly, you learn that being cautious doesn't mean being paranoid." I explained how I had developed what I called healthy skepticism, a way of building relationships gradually, while maintaining my independence and protecting my most sensitive information until trust was truly earned over time. "The goal isn't to become suspicious of everyone," I continued. "The goal is to become someone who verifies important information independently, who doesn't give anyone complete control over your life, and who trusts their own perceptions even when others try to convince you that you're wrong." After the speaking engagement, the young woman approached me privately. She explained that her roommate had been exhibiting some concerning behaviors, asking too many personal questions, handling mail and phone calls, and gradually inserting herself into the woman's professional relationships. "I kept telling myself I was being paranoid," she said. "But after hearing your story, I realized that my instincts were probably right." We talked for almost an hour about specific warning signs to watch for and practical steps she could take to protect herself. 2 weeks later, she emailed to tell me that she had discovered her roommate had been opening her mail and had actually applied for credit cards in her name. "I moved out immediately and filed a police report," she wrote. "If I hadn't heard your talk, I probably would have convinced myself that I was overreacting until it was too late." Stories like hers made all the difficulty of writing the book and reliving my trauma worthwhile. Each person who avoided becoming a victim because of what I had shared represented a small victory against people like Rachel and Kellerman. The book also connected me with Dr. Amanda Chen, the therapist who had helped me during my initial recovery. She reached out to tell me that she was using my book as a resource for other clients who had experienced similar manipulation. What you've written captures the psychological dynamics of long-term manipulation in a way that academic literature often misses, she told me. Your personal account helps other survivors understand that their experiences were real and their reactions were normal. Dr. Chen invited me to co-author an article for a psychology journal about the therapeutic treatment of identity theft trauma. The article explored how traditional therapy approaches needed to be modified to address the specific psychological injuries caused by systematic manipulation and reality distortion. Victims of identity replacement schemes often struggle with what we call gaslighting recovery, we wrote. They need to rebuild their confidence in their own perceptions and memories, which requires specialized therapeutic techniques. The article was well received in the psychology community and led to the development of new treatment protocols for manipulation trauma. Several therapy training programs began incorporating our recommendations into their curricula. 5 years after Rachel's arrest, I was invited to speak at a conference organized by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The conference brought together law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and fraud researchers from across the country to share information about emerging criminal trends. During my presentation, I shared data about the long-term impact of identity replacement schemes on victims. Our support group had been tracking the recovery progress of its members, and the results were both encouraging and sobering. Most victims require between 2 and 5 years to fully recover from the psychological impact of systematic manipulation, I reported. Financial recovery is often faster than emotional recovery, especially for victims who had strong support systems and access to professional counseling. But I also shared the positive outcomes. Every member of our support group had eventually rebuilt their lives and careers. Many had developed expertise in recognizing and preventing fraud that made them valuable resources for law enforcement and victim services organizations. Surviving sophisticated manipulation creates a unique skill set, I explained. Victims become extremely good at detecting deception, reading people's motivations, and recognizing psychological manipulation techniques. These skills often lead to career opportunities in fraud prevention, victim advocacy, and law enforcement consulting. My own career had evolved in exactly that direction. While I still maintained my graphic design business, I had increasingly been called upon to consult with companies about internal fraud prevention and employee background verification. My experience had given me insights into how manipulative people operate that were valuable in corporate security contexts. The FBI conference also provided an opportunity to meet other experts in the field of identity crime. I was particularly impressed by the work of Agent Susan Rodriguez, who had been developing new investigative techniques for tracking identity theft networks. Your case was actually a breakthrough for us, Agent Rodriguez told me. The detailed documentation you provided about Rachel's methods helped us develop new search criteria for identifying similar operations in other cities. She explained that law enforcement agencies now used what they called the Emma Sullivan Protocol when investigating suspected identity replacement schemes. The protocol included specific things to look for in financial records, communication patterns, and victim behavior that could indicate systematic manipulation was occurring. We've used your protocol to identify and prevent at least 50 similar schemes over the past 3 years, Agent Rodriguez said. The patterns you documented have become a template for recognizing this type of crime. Learning that my experience had been turned into a tool for protecting other people was profoundly meaningful. It gave purpose to the trauma I had endured and validated my decision to share my story publicly despite the emotional cost. During the conference, I also met Dr. James Morrison, a researcher from the University of Chicago who was studying the economic impact of sophisticated fraud schemes. His research showed that identity replacement crimes cost victims an average of $400,000 in direct financial losses, but the total economic impact was much higher when lost productivity, medical expenses, and other indirect costs were included. The psychological manipulation component of these crimes creates costs that we're just beginning to understand, Dr. Morrison explained. Victims often require extensive therapy, career counseling, and financial recovery services. Some never fully return to their previous earning capacity. His research reinforced something I had observed in our support group, that the financial theft was often the least damaging aspect of what we had experienced. The psychological trauma and the destruction of our ability to trust others had much longer lasting effects than the loss of money. But Dr. Morrison's research also showed that victims who received appropriate support and treatment often emerged stronger and more resilient than they had been before the crime. There appears to be a post-traumatic growth effect, he noted. Survivors develop enhanced emotional intelligence, better boundary setting skills, and increased confidence in their ability to handle difficult situations. This observation matched my own experience and that of the other members of our support group. While we would never choose to go through what we had experienced, most of us acknowledged that surviving it had made us stronger, smarter, and more compassionate people. 6 years after the Rachel ordeal began, I received a letter that I never expected. It was from Rachel herself, writing from federal prison. The letter was handwritten on standard prison stationery, and Rachel's handwriting looked different from what I remembered, less polished, more hurried. She had apparently learned that I had written a book about our experience and wanted to respond. "Dear Emma," the letter began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you don't read this letter, but I wanted you to know that I think about what I did to you every day, and I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you." I stared at the letter for several minutes before deciding to continue reading. I had spent years in therapy working through my feelings about Rachel, and I thought I was prepared for any communication from her. But seeing her handwriting again brought back a flood of emotions I hadn't expected. "I want you to know that nothing I did was your fault." The letter continued. "You were kind and trusting and generous, and I took advantage of those qualities because I was trained to do so. You didn't miss any warning signs that you should have caught. I was a professional at hiding who I really was." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing Rachel's background and how she had been recruited into Kellerman's organization. She had apparently grown up in foster care, aged out of the system at 18 with no resources or support, and had been working as a waitress when Kellerman approached her. "He told me that I had natural acting ability and could make more money in a month than I was making in a year," she wrote. "He trained me for 6 months before sending me to Portland. By the time I met you, I had already done this to 2 other women in different cities." Reading about Rachel's background didn't excuse what she had done, but it provided context that I hadn't had before. She hadn't been a master manipulator from birth. She had been recruited and trained by someone who specialized in turning vulnerable young people into criminal operatives. "I know this doesn't change anything," the letter concluded. "I know I destroyed your life for a while, and I know you'll never forgive me, but I wanted you to know that the person you thought was your friend, the version of me that cared about you and enjoyed spending time with you, that wasn't completely fake. Parts of me really did care about you, which made what I was doing even more horrible." The letter was signed simply Rebecca Walsh, the first time she had ever used her real name with me. I showed the letter to Dr. Chen during our next session. We had continued meeting occasionally even years after my initial recovery, and she had become more of a mentor than a therapist. "How does it make you feel to hear from her?" Dr. Chen asked. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Part of me is angry that she contacted me at all, but part of me is grateful for the explanation. It helps me understand that what happened wasn't random, that I wasn't uniquely gullible or stupid." Dr. Chen nodded. "Many survivors find it helpful to understand the broader context of their victimization. It can reduce self-blame and provide closure." I ultimately decided not to respond to Rachel's letter, but I kept it. Somehow, knowing that she was serving her sentence and had acknowledged the full scope of what she had done made it easier for me to close that chapter of my life completely. 7 years after first meeting Rachel, I was finally able to say that I had moved beyond the experience rather than simply survived it. I had rebuilt my life in ways that were stronger and more authentic than before. I had meaningful work that helped other people avoid similar victimization. I had genuine relationships based on mutual respect and transparency. Most importantly, I had learned to trust myself again. I could rely on my instincts, set appropriate boundaries, and build relationships gradually without being paralyzed by fear or suspicion. The woman I had become was someone I was proud to be, someone who had faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged not just intact, but improved. Rachel had tried to steal my identity, but in the end, she had helped me discover who I really was, underneath all the doubt and insecurity I had carried before meeting her. My experience had taught me that our identities are not as fragile as we think they are. Rachel could steal my money, forge my documents, and even convince some people that she was me. But she could never actually become me, because my real identity existed in my values, my relationships, my experiences, and my capacity for growth and resilience. That identity belonged to me alone, and no one could ever take it away. The story ends there, but the impact continues. Through speaking engagements, the book, and ongoing work with law enforcement, the experience that nearly destroyed me has become a source of strength not just for me, but for hundreds of other people who have faced similar challenges. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you really does turn out to be the catalyst for the best thing that could happen to you. Not because the trauma was good, but because surviving it reveals capabilities and strengths you never knew you possessed. If you're reading this because you're dealing with your own betrayal or manipulation, please know that recovery is possible, that your instincts are probably right, and that you are stronger than you realize. Trust yourself, protect yourself, and don't let anyone convince you that your perceptions are wrong. Your life belongs to you, and you have every right to defend it.